I'm trying to think how we're going to do this. Just keep following the outline, and what I'll do is kind of push the pedal to the metal a little bit, but we'll hit a point where we'll open it back up for questions. And I love your questions, and I think they're very helpful. And I'm just walking through the steps of what I actually do to prepare an expository sermon. And I just kind of want to get you in the back seat with me and go on this journey and this drive of preparing and delivering an expository sermon. And it is such an extraordinary journey. I mean, there's nothing that compares to the preparation and the proclamation of an expository sermon, to the development and the delivery of an expository sermon. It's just the most extraordinary privilege to be able to do this. So we've begun with just the different approaches to expository preaching, and that's only the first factor in determining what to preach. Let me just mention these other headings because I think they're worth noting as far as what should I preach. Number one is you just need to know what your options are. Number one is you just need what are the different routes that I could take. And without knowing what all those are, it's difficult to even know where to begin. So those are the various options. Another consideration is the listener's needs. Now, we are not seeker-sensitive people, but we do want to be sensitive to people. And we want to scratch where they itch. And we want to address real needs in their lives. And not everyone is at the same place spiritually. And as you leave here and as you go out in places of ministry and as you make decisions on what will you preach, you also need to, you're not going to be preaching in a phone booth. I mean, there are going to be real people out there, and there's a DNA in that church, and they've been going for some time, and they have strengths and they have weaknesses, and you need to be like a doctor and to be able to bring a diagnosis of what needs to be addressed. And so there are different books and different portions of Scripture that will address different needs, and you need to have just some general awareness of that. Does this church have a need for doctrine? That's what MacArthur did here at Grace Community Church 45 years ago. It was an Arminian church. It was a Methodist Arminian. It was a church that had Methodist pastors. And once he's here, he realizes, I've got to do a fly through Romans. I've got to do a fly through Ephesians. I mean, I've got to lay a groundwork here. I've got to change your whole theological worldview. The Mississippi River is not flowing south to north. It's flowing north to south. And you need to understand how salvation works. Other churches, the need is for godliness. They'll sign off on the great doctrinal confessions. They've got it. There's just carnality, and they need to become more godly. And so there are other portions of Scripture that will more readily address that head on. The Sermon on the Mount, something like that. Some churches are dead and need to be awakened. No two churches are in the same place. I mean, look at the 7 letters to the 7 churches that Jesus brought. He didn't say one thing 7 times to the 7 different churches. He said something totally unique and different to each church. And as you go out, you need to make assessments as well. And if I was preaching and trying to wake up the dead, I mean, there are just certain portions of Scripture that lend itself, that are more catalytic. It could be for comfort. It could be for conversions. I mean, you may realize the church that I have come to pastor, now that I'm here, suddenly I'm realizing that not everybody knows the Lord here. And the church's first mission is its own members, to reach them. And so I'd preach the Gospel of John or 1 John or the book of Hebrews with those warning passages. The other thing to consider is a necessary balance. I mean, after I preached Philippians, I don't know that I'd immediately go to Colossians, then immediately go to Ephesians, then immediately go to Galatians and just do all short epistles, just rapid fire succession. I would want there to be some balance, some symmetry. And I would balance long books and short books. I would balance the genre from narrative to epistle, from epistle to poetry to prophecy. I would want to have some variety. Old Testament, New Testament, book study, doctrinal study, biographical study. Those are all things that I weigh in my mind. Also, I would want to consider my own abilities. I mean, Dr. MacArthur himself has said, I am so glad that I waited 20 years in ministry before I preached 2 Corinthians. He said, I could have never preached that book when I first went into the ministry. I didn't know anything of suffering in the ministry. And I now, after 20 years or 25 years, can address this book with a sense of reality. I've experienced this. I've lived this. And so I think as you would begin, you want to preach something that you can get your arms around. I mean, it could be a challenge if your first book you went out and preached Isaiah, 66 chapters. That might not be the wisest call. You might want to preach something that I can get my arms around. It's not going to be a long, extended series. And that I can develop my own giftedness and move out to more difficult and challenging books to preach. You also need to consider to whom you're preaching. There have been many times my wife has said to me, Steve, you are not the pastor of Grace Community Church. You know, you're not preaching to people who have sat under expository preaching for 50 years. There's times she has said to me, you're not the pastor of 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, you know, where they've had 200 years of expositors. You know, you need to feed the people who are immediately before you. And so that requires some sensitivity to what they can take in. You need to give some thought to the amount of time that you have to give to this series. Because some books, it requires more study in preparation. And so you need to give thought to that. And then obviously to seek the Lord's direction. And part of that is also God works through a multitude of godly counselors and to ask some other people and to seek their inquiry, but to pray about it. So that's that. Once I've locked in on a book, the longer I've preached, the more I have realized that there must be an orientation to this book. And by that I mean I need to have the information that's on those first 3 or 4 pages, the introduction that's in the MacArthur Study Bible. I need to have that almost memorized. I need to know about the author, the historical setting, the theological themes. What are the interpretive challenges? Before I begin to preach this book, or I'm going to be into this book to chapter 3 or chapter 4 and suddenly realize, oh, I didn't realize that that's what the thrust of this book is. I'm going to have to go back and re-preach chapter 2 because I didn't know. I mean, if you preach the book of Hebrews, for example, you're going to have to figure out what these warning passages are about before you start preaching through that book. Or you're going to be into this book and suddenly realize, oh, I thought he was addressing believers. He was addressing unbelievers. This really changes a lot. And so the general orientation. So I would just encourage you, sometimes in seminary, some classes can be rather tedious, OTI classes, NTI classes. But that information, before you begin to preach a book in the Bible, you need to have at least a general awareness of what are the unique issues involved in this book. And there have been times I've had my secretary just Xerox every 3-page introduction out of the MacArthur Study Bible, 3-hole punch them, put them in a notebook, and I just get on airplanes, and when I'm going to preach someplace, just read all of those introductions to give me an understanding of each book in the Bible. And what is the historical background? Who is the author? Who are the recipients? What are the driving issues? Why was this book written? I mean, we just need to have this information in us. And so, after I graduated, I went to law school before I went to seminary. And I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and I took a leave of absence and worked for a politician who was a lawyer and worked out of his law office. And I saw that everything that I was having to study in law school, it wouldn't be over once I graduated. That I would actually be doing this only more for the rest of my life. And that was a chilling thought for me. It's like I thought, well, if I could just get through this in law school, then I'll have that behind me, and then I'll just go out and be a lawyer. And maybe some people do that. Well, the same is true for seminary. All of these classes you're taking, it's not, well, if I can just get through this, I'll have that behind me, and then I'll go out and preach the Bible. No, you're actually going to be studying this stuff more, not less. You're going to be reading these OTI and NTI and theologies and all of this. You're going to have this information. And so I find myself going back to these books that I thought were so boring. Like, I've got to get the gold out of these mountains and get them on backpacks, on backs of donkeys to take them down to the market. I've got to have this material. So, without going into all the specifics, you can see and you can anticipate what I would have under these headings. But I actually need to jump through all these hoops. I need to be aware of this. And Dr. MacArthur will preach an introductory sermon to a book in the Bible. And he will frame that book, and his headings will, be like the author, the recipients, the aim, the challenges, the setting. And in order that not only he, but the church will know what this book is about and where this is headed and what's the central thrust and what are the interpretive issues of this book. So, after that, I want to then begin to see the literary units in that book. I want to see, and this will be dependent upon the genre of the literature. If it's narrative, you move from story to story to story, and you're sizing this up. These are my preaching units. Even if I preach more than one sermon, nevertheless, these are the boundaries. And I will be preaching this unit, whether in one sermon, 2 sermons, or 3 sermons. And some of Dr. MacArthur's greatest series that he's done is to isolate that literary unit, those 10 verses, and preach multiple sermons out of that. And it's almost like a series within a series. It's a standalone series, virtually. That's narrative. With wisdom literature and Hebrew poetry, I mean, when you read the Psalms, you're looking for the stanzas. And they're even broken out for us in our English Bible with the white space in between certain lines where you can just visually see it. And there'll be difference from one translation to another because it's just a translator's call. But you've got to see the stanzas. When you look at the book of Proverbs, chapters 1 through 9, there's clusters. There are those, some 13 sections. And so that's your literary unit. My son, hear the teaching of your father, and do not reject the teaching of your mother, and blah, 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 blah. Define the literary unit. In prophecy, it's the vision. And isolating that single, unique vision And that's your preaching unit. In the Gospels, there are multiple preaching units. There is a genealogy, there is narrative, there are discourses, there are parables, there are a variety of literary units. You have got to isolate those. And I'll take a piece of paper and just write out what I think are those literary units, and it's helpful to have a study Bible with an outline built into the text to help see where these divisions are. And this is what we're going to be doing as we get into the book, is how many verses am I going to preach? What is the call here? And so you've got to divide it up. Then, after that, then you need to, within the literary unit, decide which verses within that literary unit will I preach. And as I said, younger men tend to preach more verses in the literary unit, may even preach the entire literary unit. Older men will tend to preach fewer number of verses within that literary unit. But you need to make the call, and there are other factors as well. How long the book is. If there's 50 chapters in this book, you probably need to keep the pace going. I preached through the first half of Ezekiel. I did one chapter at a time. If I went any slower, I would lose everyone. And so I need to keep the pace going. With epistles, let's say it's 4 chapters, you can preach fewer verses. And there's more stuffed into a sentence in the epistle. It's compact. Well, that's a part of learning how to preach, is how many verses. And sometimes you will sense in the congregation, I need to pick up my pace. I need to begin to take in more verses where they feel like we're working our way through the book. And then other times, like on a long trip, sometimes Dad just needs to pull the car over on the side and let everybody out of the car and let's rest for a moment. You can do that as you preach through books. You can hit certain points and just kind of pull over and park and preach that multiple times. I did it, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13 and preached all those sermons. I need to get back in the car now, get everybody in the back seat, and head on out and finish this trip, and I will take in more verses. And so there can be this ebb and flow regarding the number of verses that you take in. So that's a key consideration. And as you preach in preaching lab classes, you're going to have to make a determinative call. How many verses am I going to try to take in? Next, depending upon your level of skill in the original languages and how many classes you've had to this point, you're going to want to read the passage in the original language. And to read it and to try to have a working translation of it, depending upon how many verses, depending upon how well you're able to operate in that original language, even if you were using an interlinear, just to work your way through some translation work to become acquainted with the words. And while you're doing that, you're going to have to be aware of textual problems. If you're preaching John, are you going to preach John 8? Are you not going to preach John 8? If you're preaching Mark, are you going to preach the end of Mark? You're not going to preach the end of Mark. If you're preaching the Lord's Prayer, are you or are you not going to preach the end of verse 13? And so you've got to do some textual problem solving and come to grips with that yourself. And so after you translate, you now begin to observe. You cannot interpret until you do the observations. You want to scrutinize the passage. So I'll just tell you what I do. I Xerox a page out of my Bible. I'll Xerox it a couple of times, and I'll just pull out a pen. And I begin to, I'm like Sherlock Holmes, just looking for clues. I'm looking for the verbs, the main verbs. The action is in the verbs. I'm looking for key theological words. I am looking for cause and effect. I am looking for contrast. I am looking for emphatic position. I am looking who, what, when, where, why, how. I am trying to size this up. This is like a courtship with this text. And I just want to ask questions of this text as if I'm just meeting someone. Where did you grow up? What was your major? Et cetera, et cetera. I want to learn all that I can about this. I want to see, the old questions. Is there a commandment to obey? Is there an example to follow? Is there a sin to avoid? Is there a truth to embrace? I mean, I'm just observing everything. I remember when I was in seminary, the first day in Bible study methods class, we were assigned Acts 1:8, and the assignment was, come back in 2 days, written out 50 observations from Acts 1:8. I thought he meant Acts chapter 1 through chapter 8. He meant chapter 1, verse 8. Are you kidding me? 50 observations from one verse in the Bible? And the point was, and he didn't stop there. We'd come back, turn it in, he'd give us another verse. And the point was to make us take our Bibles, turn it upside down, inside out, look at it in every possible direction. And you can't, the old saying in baseball, you can't hit what you can't see. Well, you can't interpret what you can't see. And you can't preach what you can't see. And so you need to see as much as you can by observations. So, critically important stage. And I know that you know that. So, you read the passage. You read it devotionally. You read it analytically. You read it grammatically. You read it meditatively. I mean, you just read it and read it and read it to the point where you virtually can quote it without even trying to memorize it. It's just a part of you. And for me to learn, I need to pull a pen out. I need to be writing on it. I need to interact with it visually and with my hand. And for me, that's just the way that I learn. So that is observation, and you're going to have to be involved in observation. Then after that, moving, you can see maybe in your outline, to organization, structure the sentence. That's a block diagram. And you've had classes on block diagramming. And I'll just take a piece of paper and just write it out. Sometimes I'll be at a restaurant and pull a napkin out of the holder and put it down. I'll take a piece of paper I've already written on one side. I'll pull it out of the trash can, turn it over, and just begin, flush left, subject, verb, object. I'll begin to line up modifiers under those words that they modify. I'm looking for parallelism and repetition and repeating and lining those up under those words that they modify. I'm putting prepositional phrases under what they modify. I'm putting adjectives and adverbs. I began to learn English better than when I was taking English classes. I'm looking for conjunctions and movement from one sentence to the next, and suddenly words like therefore and now and this and words like that begin to leap off the page at me because they're pivotal words, and I need to put it in a block diagram. And so I would just urge you to do that, to visually see. I'm a visual learner. I'm not a... If I hear something, I don't remember it. If I see it, I remember it. And so that's why I have to see the sentence broken out and lined up in a way that I can begin to see how I'm going to preach it. And then, reduction, summarize the sentence. I will try to compress down in one sentence what is the point, what is the authorial intent of this number of verses that I am isolating that I will preach. And I want to do it in a couple of different ways. One, I will want to do it where it is just sheer 2,000 years ago. This is what Paul was saying to the Corinthians. And then I will want to give a more contemporary version of that in the modern setting. And rather than it's Paul addressing the Corinthians, it's really more in language of what I will emphasize yet to the people I am preaching this to. So that kind of finishes out that little section on observation. Now, let's just kind of press on to interpretation. And so once we've had this initial orientation to the passage by reading it, by translating it, by sentence block diagramming it, reducing it down to a sentence, I now need to begin to play hardball with this text. And I've just listed here, I really don't want to go into all this because this is a preaching class, but I have this listed because I want you to know that all the classes that you are taking, you're going to use this week after week after week after week. This is all a part of the discipline of expository preaching. So, you're going to begin to study the grammar. You're going to begin to study the syntax, which is the relationship of words to themselves within the sentence. You're going to have to study the historical background. I mean, how could you preach on one of the prison epistles without delving into where Paul was, the circumstances that he was in, the Praetorian Guard? We have to have this historical background. How could we preach on Jesus without even knowing who the Pharisees were, or what they believed, or how were they different from the Sadducees, or who in the world are the scribes? How could you preach? I just preached, the Christmas account. I mean, I had to preach, Julius, not Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and what is the Roman Empire, and what is the relationship to Israel. You just have to get this historical background. If you're going to preach the 7 letters to the 7 churches, you're going to have to know something about Ephesus, something about Sardis, something about Philadelphia, something about Laodicea. You're just going to have to do it. And so you're going to have the books to look this stuff up. 1, to know what does it mean by what it says, and 2, how you're going to explain this to people. The geography. There are many passages where that is just critically important, even to the point of topography. Figures of speech, that's huge. I would encourage you, there's one book I would encourage you to get. It's the easiest book to read, and it's like basically all that you need to know on this. It is Roy Zook's book, Basic Bible Interpretation. Are you familiar with that book? Honestly, this is not hyperbole. We ought to read that book like once every 3 years. Seriously. This is like a physician having to read a book on the human body. You just need to know where the lungs are and where the liver is and all that. It'd be hard to be a doctor without knowing the basics on that. And we really need to know just the basics of Bible interpretation. It gets it all out on the table, and it's neatly organized, and it's so simply written. The cookies are on the bottom shelf. It's not laborious to read. He's even got all those figures of speech listed in that, and he's got them categorized in such an easy way. And then the cross-references, and to know how to use cross-references. And I'm sure you've been taught that in your exegetical classes. And you begin with the immediate context, and then you work out to where else in this same book, and then where else this same author uses addresses the same truth or uses the same word in another book, and then another book of the same genre by a different author, and then by another book of a different genre in the same testament, and then you work your way out to the other testament, and how you actually use cross-references to bolster what you're saying or to clarify what you're saying. One of the significant features of John MacArthur's preaching is just the proliferation of cross-references. I mean, you are more than making your point. The whole Bible is speaking to what is said in this text. I mean, if I don't buy into this, it's not just this text, it's the whole Bible I would be standing against. And it's persuasive, and it brings a weight of evidence to bear upon this subject. And so looking up these cross-references, critically important in even understanding what this passage is saying. And therefore, we have to be aware of progressive revelation, and things mentioned early in the Scripture become brighter and brighter and more clear as we work our way through Scripture. Even the New Testament admits that many things in the New Testament are a mystery now revealed, that were not revealed in the Old Testament. And then to study our commentaries. And commentaries are our friend. Commentaries are our teacher. God has given gifted men to the church. What a blessing it is that we can have at our disposal, as though these men are sitting across the table from us, bringing their theological, exegetical insight to us through the printed page. And so anyway, I'm huge on using commentaries. And then study other examples. And by that I mean reading other expository sermons. And to see not only how other commentators address this, but how other gifted, worthy preachers have addressed this. And not only what conclusions to which they have come to, but how they have laid out their argument. I want to learn this. And so I want to have all of these influences being brought to bear upon me. And as I'm going through this, I am taking notes. You may be cutting and pasting. You're accumulating an exegetical digest. You're accumulating a war chest of information. It's not all organized just yet, but you're compiling it. Everything that I need to know. For me, like with my commentaries, I read them and I Xerox them, read them, and I mark them up because I'm coming back through and I'm going to be extracting from these commentaries what I'm going to be restating and placing into my manuscript. As well as, for me, I'm Xeroxing dictionaries, encyclopedias, concordances, etc., and I'm marking them up, and I'm going to have them all out in front of me. And so this is the fact-finding mission. I'm trying to get it all on the table, everything that I need to know to understand this passage. But still, this is not yet a sermon, but I've got to get to this point. So let me pause just for a moment and give you a chance to give thought to what I've just said, and to give you opportunity to ask any questions that you might want to ask. But this is kind of the blood, sweat, toil, and tears of expository preaching. This is the laborious part, the heavy lifting of just having to dig it out. Yes, sir.
Professor, exegetical commentaries or expositional commentaries?
Great question. Do I prefer exegetical or expositional? The answer is yes. You've got to have both. And for me, there's layers and tiers of commentaries. And for me, I'll just tell you, when I go to prepare to preach, I'll Xerox everything I need to read. I start with the simplest and work to the most complex. So I have like 7 study Bibles with just, little notes at the bottom of the I start at the most kindergarten level, the most basic level. And if it's in a study Bible footnote, it has to be somewhat important because they've had to make choices about what they comment on. And then I'll move from study Bible footnotes to kind of a popular style commentary, which would be like MacArthur's commentary. I would read. I read Wiersbe. I mean, not many people admit to reading Wiersbe. I'm a beggar looking for crumbs. I'll take crumbs from anybody. Okay. You get a lot of outlines from Wiersbe. And if it's in Wiersbe, I mean, he's not commenting on everything, but if he's commenting on it, it's probably like fairly important. I'm reading James Montgomery Boyce. I love Boyce. I'm a Boyce fanatic. I'm reading Alexander Maclaren. I'm reading Calvin's sermons. And then I'm working my way up towards more exegetical, that are hard reading commentaries. Some guys do the reverse. To me, it just makes sense. You start in kindergarten and end up in a PhD program. I mean, you would just work your way up the ladder that way. Some are devotional type commentaries. Some are just pure explanatory. Some have application in them. I'm putting boxes around things, asterisks, stars, exclamation points, question marks, underlining, circles, squares, triangles, arrows, just whatever that'll catch my eye so I don't have to reread everything again, just so I can go straight to it and begin to assimilate a preaching manuscript. So I would start with the simplest and work to the hardest. Yes, sir?
Going back to preaching in the power of the Spirit.
Yeah.
For you, do you feel like, are you confident you're preaching in the power of the Spirit if you've consecrated yourself to God and faithfully and accurately divided the Word of God?
Obviously, being filled with the Spirit can be a somewhat subjective thing. And, as MacArthur said, I don't have a red light on my forehead that goes on when I'm filled with the Spirit, and it's blinking when I'm not filled with the Spirit. So it's not easy to always know that. I can only do what I can do and what God would have me to do, which would be to humble myself before Him, to confess my sins to Him, to worship Him, to ask that He would bless His people in the preaching of His Word, that God would enable me to do what He's called me to do, that God would fill me by His Spirit, that God would touch my lips as with a hot iron, hot coal, and purify me, cleanse me, empower me. And I actually kind of go through my autonomy. God, with my mind, would you renew and activate my mind? Would you cause it to act, to think quickly, to think correctly? God, my heart, my emotions, my affections, would you thrill my heart with these truths? Would you not allow me to be clinical? Would you not allow me to be merely academic? May this be experiential for me. May I weep where you weep in this. May I rejoice where you do. And I'm praying that in my study. I'm praying this in the car as I drive to church. I pray that at church once I get there. I pray this while we're singing the hymns. As I walk up to the pulpit, I'm consciously aware of this thought, that there are two who are stepping into the pulpit, that God is with me. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. That God, I trust, will fill me and enable me to do this. And that's all I can do. And I can't do anything else but do that. So There are times, 2 Sundays ago, I felt like I could have preached for 8 hours. I felt like I was skydiving. I mean, it was just an out-of-body experience. I mean, my mind, my thoughts, the way I was saying it, it was all so quick. It was emphatic. And there are other times, the feeling is totally different. I feel like I'm driving with the emergency brake on. And I don't even know how to interpret all of that. If that means I am not filled with the Spirit, or for whatever reason God would have me to be more dependent on Him. I'm consciously aware even as I'm preaching. God, give me greater grace to keep preaching. So, when it's over, I want to have some pleasure from what I've preached. I'm incredibly hard on myself. I kind of beat myself up. I wish I had said this. I wish I had not said that. I wish I could have been more of this and less of that, and whatever that was. And I ask God to let me just rest. I've done it. I can't change it. Would you use it? Would you allow me to take pleasure in it? That I've served you and that you've helped me to serve you. And would you save people? Would you sanctify people? And, I'm driving home praying. And then I'm ready to step back in to the whole thing and do it all over again, for tonight. And I mean, you just it's final exam week every week. And you're just living in the crunch, but we love this. This is what we went to seminary for. This is what we left the bank for. This is what we live for. It's the thrill of being in the game and being in the mix of all of this. It's the thrill of our heart, and so it's hard. It's demanding, and we're having to continually consecrate ourselves and yield ourselves to God, and yet we love the challenge of it, the thrill of it. So I sometimes I feel confident that I'm filled with the Spirit, and at other times, I don't know how to even exegete myself. I don't know how to evaluate it.
Let's say when you are preaching through a book, and have you had the time that you are trying to reconcile with everything in the text, and you still wrestling on maybe one point of the text that you can have a final conclusion, but it's time for you to preach that text? What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you're taxiing. You're the pilot of an airplane, and you're taxiing down the runway, and there's trees at the end of the runway. I mean, you're just going to have to pull up. You just can't prolong this. Well, I mean, you need to know what the text says, and you can't just step off of a building and pray the angels will catch you. I mean, you've got to know before you get up in the pulpit what this says, and if you don't, then you need to almost acknowledge there's a particular point here that is a debatable point, and I'm still wrestling with understanding what this says, and I will bring my understanding to you at a later time. And truth is its own best defense, and I would just acknowledge that and say that. And I've done that recently in my church, and I people are coming up to me like, so what is it? And you've almost created more interest by doing it this way than if you'd have just said something vague, be warm, be filled, and they wouldn't have cared. But the fact that, so yeah, I'm having to wrestle with things. And it's not as easy always as it seems.
Yeah, after you're doing your work in the text and you come out with the outline, and then you dig into the commentaries, and then you just look at MacArthur's, he has like a clear outline, and you're comparing with your crappy outline.
Yeah.
How do you guard against like plagiarism?
Yeah.
With taking a text from like a really good commentator that has a clear very clear outline.
You just say on your first sermon at that church, everything for the next 20 years is from John MacArthur, okay? You just get it out on the front at the very beginning. Well, here's the deal, even with our beloved John. You read William Hendrickson, I see where he's getting it. You read Martin Lloyd-Jones, I see where he's getting it. And, you read Spurgeon and you see where Hendrickson got it. And so this is being passed down from generation to generation. Now, Dr. MacArthur does an extraordinary amount of just independent thought and many times takes a minority position on things. But, I think that's why we really have to be dependent upon multiple sources. We can't just be dependent upon one man, or we will end up plagiarizing. We will end up being an echo coming out of a cave, where one man has preached into the cave and we're the echo that comes out. That's not good. But research involves studying multiple people and then learning how to restate it in your own words. Other than the Bible, the one book I use more than any other book that sits right there in the very center of my desk. Even my wife's picture is off on the side of the desk. Right there is my thesaurus, my word finder, because I'm just constantly searching for synonyms to restate what I'm learning from other men. And I want to recraft it and restate it. And at the same time, one of the strengths of Dr. MacArthur's preaching, I don't know if you've noticed this, but he will simply restate what his understanding of that text is. And there will be like 5 following sentences, and he will restate it in kind of a more popular way, a more vernacular expression. All he's doing is restating. And we need to learn how to restate. When I went to get my Doctor of Ministry degree, I went to Reformed Theological Seminary because R.C. Sproul was teaching there. I wanted to study under him. First day of class, we're sitting here. He makes the first assignment. He assigns us 300 English vocabulary words. And the next day, when we come back to class, we're tested on 300 English vocabulary words. And his whole point was to force us to learn how to restate with other words, better words, and to layer out our words for the different people to whom we're preaching. Some words are for lawyers and doctors. Some words are for teenagers. Some words are for uneducated. Some words are for college professors. You say the same thing, yet at different levels. And your vocabulary and your command of synonyms and your ability to speak in metaphors will set the ceiling high or low above you on how well you can communicate what the meaning of this text is. To this day, I ate dinner with R.C. several times in December. I am eating dinner, and he is literally parsing my sentences, parsing my verbs. And he's still after me to have better words that I use. I use the word very. He all but slapped me. He did. He said that means you had a weak word and you had to put very in front of it to prop up a weak word. Now, you need to have a vocabulary. I'm 61 years old, okay? He's lecturing me on having this better vocabulary. But he's trying to help me so that when I stand in the pulpit and preach the Word of God, that I have a command of the English language. And so that's a part of, like, I don't want to just parrot MacArthur Well, if you don't have a good vocabulary, you'll have to. But if you have an ever-increasing, expanding depth of words and expressions and an ability to speak in metaphors and to use analogies, then you won't have to repeat MacArthur. You can say it in an even better way as it's coming through you to the people to whom you're speaking. So I would urge all of you to have a thesaurus sitting right on your desk, right in front of you, a Bible and a thesaurus. And also, as I'm working outlines, I mean that thesaurus is just constantly open in front of me. As I'm looking for better words for point 3 or point 4. And as I am manuscripting, I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to use the same word twice. Certainly not 3 times. And so I'm alternating words as well. And even in my manuscripting, I am expanding my vocabulary and not waiting for the moment when I'm standing in the pulpit. But in all of our preaching, we depart from our notes and we go beyond our notes. We stand on the shoulders of our notes and reach yet higher. And so you've got to have in your arsenal, you must have already made these deposits in your mind. So it's not just that we need to know Greek and Hebrew. We've got to know English. Now, let me just tell you something else. Great preachers have a command of the English language. There's a reason why James Montgomery Boyce was an English major at Harvard. There's a reason why John Piper was an English major at Wheaton. There's a reason why John MacArthur was an English minor. Great preachers have a command of the English language. If you can't talk, it's hard to preach. Hadn't stopped some, but... So, there are different ways to expand your use of the English language, but your preaching will, in some part, be limited or expanded by your command of the English language. Now, you're going to have to... And let me tell you, when I graduated from seminary, my English was awful. Awful. And I had these little legalistic English teachers in my class, and in my congregation, who would come up and correct my... It's humiliating. It's humbling. I was using words that weren't even words. Irregardless is not a word. How could I possibly know that? Making your subject and verb agree, using the right case for pronouns. You have got to get it right. And who is to say where you're going to end up 10 years from now and what possible ministry opportunities you would have, and you are not going to want to embarrass yourself in those settings.
You often, as you're explaining things, you grab for word pictures frequently. You either jump into sports, or jump into nature, fishing, farming. How did you grow in speaking with word pictures and just being able to grab for those kind of things?
Yeah.
Offhand?
One, in some ways, I don't know how I do it. Second, reading Spurgeon and reading the Puritans is an extraordinary help. Now, there's a real skill involved when you read old preachers. You don't want to sound verbatim like that today. You will sound archaic, out of touch, stilted, Victorian. But the power of the metaphor. For example, a metaphor can be given in one sentence. All a metaphor is an illustration. An illustration may take 5 minutes. It may take 4 minutes to tell. How much better if I could say the same thing in one sentence and move on to more truth than to have to literally pull over, park, get out of the car, give this entire illustration, get back in the car, turn the car back on, and then head down the road. If I could just do it in a metaphor or an illustration. I don't know how that's happened. When I teach in the D-Min class here, and one of the students wrote down after a week all my metaphors and all my little one-liners. And it was just like, oh, this is too painful to, to have to look at. I mean, this is really funny. Am I actually saying all of this? But, great preachers use all the figures of speech. I'll tell you one thing. The greatest thing that I have done that's helped my preaching as far as what I have preached is to preach all 150 Psalms. When you preach, you do not want to sound like a letter. A letter is like an email. A letter is like a text. When you preach, you don't want to sound like a letter writer. You want to be more of a poet. You want to be a poet with a prophet's fire. And in the Psalms, there's some 30 different figures of speech. If all you do is preach out of the epistles and read the epistles, you're just going to sound like either an email or you're going to sound like a lawyer. You're just arguing a point, always arguing a point. You never are opening windows and letting light shine into the communication. And so as a result of preaching the Psalms, I had to interpret the Psalms. I had to sentence block diagram, as I'm going through these things. Even just the parallelism. A line, B line, A line, B line. I'm a better letter writer, even, just as a result of preaching through the Psalms. And to have those figures of speech, which include the analogy and the metaphor. As the deer pants after the water brook, so my heart pants after you, O God. Well, I can see that. I can even feel something of that. To just say, are you thirsty for God? How much better to say, as the deer pants for the water brook, so does my heart pant after you, O God. The wicked are not so. They're like the chaff that is driven by the wind. That's an analogy. That's a metaphor. It's just a little brush picture. To be able to speak like that is to be a very effective communicator. I enjoy reading Churchill's speeches. The power of the metaphor. The power, not only of the metaphor, to lay out a sentence and the cadence of a sentence. You have to work at that. You have to read great writing as well, great literature, in order to be able to craft your sentences and to command your words. I think it's one of the values of manuscripting, is that when I manuscript, it is as though I am hearing myself preach. I don't want to write a commentary. I don't want to sound like an encyclopedia. I don't want my notes to even look like that or sound like that or talk like that. I want to write my notes as though I can hear myself preach. And so I want to be emphatic. I want to be descriptive. I want to be clear. I want to be convincing. And so by writing my manuscript, I am using my word finder. I'm using my thesaurus. I am thinking out ahead of analogies and metaphors and ways of expression. And so as a result I took like 5 years to preach the Psalms. That has a way of integrating itself into your speech patterns and into your thought patterns. You know, the old thing, garbage in, garbage out. You know, good food in, health. Good literature in. Good vocabulary in. Good powers of communication in. Then when you open your mouth and begin to speak, you subconsciously draw upon that.
You use Word Finder. Do you have a specific thesaurus that you're using?
Yeah. I have the Oxford English. I guess it's not dictionary. It's the Oxford English thesaurus. I have. It's like I have the dictionary and the thesaurus. It's a little set. And I think that there may even be some better word finders. And I have a couple of others, but these are just so accessible and handy, and I can just have it there on my desk. Now, I asked a man who knew James Montgomery Boyce once, tell me one thing that sticks out in your mind about James Montgomery Boyce. I mean, I knew him and what a great man he was. He said, I'll tell you the one thing that just, I don't know why I'm saying this, but it just sticks out in my mind. He said, he's the only man I know in the ministry who owns the full 23-volume Oxford English Dictionary and uses it. Well, that goes back to he was an English major. His wife was an English major. They had this common interest in the language. You read these sermons. I mean, R.C. Sproul has told me, he said, I think it's the hardest genre that there is to write, is to take an expository sermon and to polish it and put it into print. Because it has to have the content of exposition, but it cannot sound encyclopedic. And so, what a skill set is involved, really, to be an expositor. Because you have to have the theology, the exegesis, the background, the history, the knowledge, and yet there has to be wow factor in your communication. There has to be interest. You have to be compelling and be persuasive, yet to use all of this data and this information. You are marrying together two very challenging realms. The knowledge of the truth, and yet to be able to express it in a very compelling, winsome, inspiring, motivating way. That's a huge challenge. And if it was easy, we'd all be good. And some people have an aptitude, and the rest of us just have to work hard. Well, one question, then we'll take our break.
Where we're at in the notes, we're transitioning from kind of the study into the writing of the rough draft.
Yeah,
and I find that's typically the point where I have some of the most challenge is I'm not sure when exactly to start writing my rough draft. Like, I haven't studied this enough. I got to keep going,
That's a great question.
So sometimes I feel like I've jumped prematurely into writing a rough draft, and then I end up going back and spending a lot of time changing the garbage that I wrote. Sometimes I feel like I've wasted too much time studying things that I should have started writing my draft a long time ago.
Oh, that's huge. I mean, that's why when we begin to preach as expositors, people say, well, how long did it take you to prepare that message? That's why, honestly, we'll give an answer. It took me, 20 hours, 24 hours, 25 hours to pull that together. It's because of the trial and error of that. And now, how long does it take? Well, it may be 12 instead of 22. I'm still doing the same studying. It's just not the trial and error of what you're describing on that. I try to get to my rough draft as swiftly as I can. You know, a man once told me, when I began to write books, I said, give me one key on how to write books. He said, get it onto paper as quickly as you can. It's much easier to edit than it is to create. Get it onto paper as quickly as you can. So I think one danger might be to be doing so much assimilating that maybe wait too long to get it onto paper. Once you get it onto paper, you can begin to work with it. You can begin to massage it. You can begin to tweak it. You begin to prune it. You begin to add to it. You can move it around. You can work with it. So that would be one thing that I would say. That's a great question, and I think that it's kind of like riding a bike. I mean, to begin, you just have to get on that bike and crash. You know, but get up, dust yourself off, and you can go maybe a couple more feet, and then you run into a tree. And you get up and get back on the bike, and pretty soon you're wobbling, and after a while, you know, this is a whole lot easier. I think that there is a learned skill that comes through practice and trial and error and the frustration of what you're saying. And trust me, I've done that. And it's like I learned in seminary, but I learned for the exam, and I learned for the paper, and I learned for the deadline. And it wasn't until I got out into the ministry and I had Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and it's like, you know what, I'm really learning this now. And I'm retaining it because it was more of a hands-on experience for me. So I would just encourage you to get back on the bike and to know, you know, you're going to be better the next time, and you're going to go further before you fall off. And pretty soon you won't be falling off. You learn your own. You learn your own how you learn, and you learn who you are and how you work most effectively. You learn when in the day my mind works the best. You learn where the books are and how to get it out of the books. You learn how to get it onto paper. You learn how to economize your time. You learn how to take some shortcuts. I mean, you learn. But there's only one way to learn, and that's just to jump in and do it. And that's part of the desperation of when you get out of seminary and you're just thrown out into this thing, and you sink or swim. But you'll swim.